Good morning. You've tuned into another edition of the Religious Roundtable, which is sponsored by the Southern Berkshire Clergy Fellowship. I'm John Whiteman. I'm a retired United Church of Christ minister living in Sheffield. I attend Old Parish Church there, which has services every Sunday at 10 a.m. My guest this morning is Kay Loudon. Kay is the pastor of the First Congregational Church of Housatonic. And we're delighted that she can share the program with us this morning.
Thank you, John, for inviting me this morning.
It's good to have you here, Kay. On this day in the middle of the election season and in the middle of Hurricane Sandy, which has affected me directly. This morning I'm unshaven and not as clean as I'd like to be because I haven't had power for about 48 hours. But that won't affect our study here today, and we hope that what we have to say will be of interest and of use to you. What we're going to do today is we're going to be following the lectionary readings for Sunday, November 4th. And you are invited to listen to our wrestling with the text for the day. And it might just trigger off some questions or some ideas that you'll bring with you when you go to worship later in the day, because it's possible that your pastor will be preaching from these texts as well. So the particular text for today, and this is called the 31st Sunday in Ordinary Time, Ruth 1 to 18, Psalm 146, Hebrews 9, 11 to 14, and Mark 12, 28 to 34. Kay and I have decided that we're going to talk in particular about the passage from Ruth and also the passage from Mark. So I'm going to begin by leading us like kind of a discussion and a reading of Ruth, and then Kay will follow up with Mark later on. Ruth is, as you know, is one of is in the Old Testament, and it follows 5 books of history: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua. And then there are 2 more books of history that follow it, and so it's kind of inserted in the middle of historical books in the Old Testament. And it's a story more than anything else. It's a well-written, skillful, subtle story, which I think has a profound point. I should also notice that that this is the first in 2 installments of Ruth. We're only going to be looking at the first chapter, and a week from Sunday, we visit Ruth again so that we pick up the end of the story as well. Now, I'm probably, during the course of the study today, I'm going to tip off what's going to happen at the end, because that's an important part of the story. But still, the 2 belong together, and that might be of interest to you as well, because you can begin thinking thoughts about Ruth and work with it as the week goes on. So let me read it to you first, and then we'll proceed from there. This is chapter 1 in Ruth, verses 1 to, I'm going to go to verse 19. And it's my translation is the New Revised Standard Version. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. And a certain man of Bethlehem in Judah went to live in the country of Moab, he and his wife and 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab and remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. When they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband, the woman in this case being Ruth, of course. Then Ruth started to return with her daughters-in-law from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the country of Moab that the Lord had considered his people and given them food. So she set out from the place where she had been living, she and her 2 daughters-in-law, and they went on their way to go back to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you, as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find security, each of you in the house of your husband." Then she kissed them, and they wept aloud. They said to her, "No, we will return with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Do I still have sons in my womb that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters. Go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. Even if I thought there was hope for me, even if I should have a husband tonight and bear sons, would you then wait until they were grown? Would you then refrain from marrying? No, my daughter, it has been far more bitter for me than for you, because the hand of the Lord has turned against me." Then they wept aloud again. Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. So Naomi said, "See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law." But Ruth said, "Do not press me to leave you or to turn back from following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die. There will I be buried. May the Lord do thus and so to me, and more as well, even if death parts me from you." When Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more. So the 2 of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. Now, just one other piece of introduction that I think might be helpful to those of you that are listening to this text is that in this text you have to put yourself back into the society of its times. This is probably about 10 years before the time of Jesus. 1,000 years before the time of Jesus, and this is a time of female impoverishment, so that a woman's wealth and her sense of being lay in her husband. And when her husband died, his property would go to a brother, if there was a brother available, or it could even go back to his father. But that's where the wealth was. And if the marriage was broken and the husband died, the woman had nothing. And so what you have here are a story of 3 women in a patriarchal society, and they're desperate. They're trying to figure out a way to survive.
This could have been a death sentence for these 3 women.
That's right. And yet, they're very practical, and obviously from the story, we're going to learn that they have ways of dealing with their situation, which are going to prove to be successful before the story is over. But still, it's a very, very tense, tight time for them. I don't know. That just came to me as I was reading. Did anything else come to you?
Yeah, and I think that's why Naomi is saying, go back to your mother's house. Go back to the house where you were born, because I don't have any brother. I don't have your husbands don't have any brothers, because it was also the tradition of the time that when a man died, that his brother became the husband of his wife.
That's right. That's right.
To keep them going and to keep them, so that they could survive.
Yep.
And that was a pretty typical thing that happened. And that's what Naomi is saying here, is that, I'm not going to have any more sons for you to marry. And even if I were to have a son tonight or conceive a son tonight and have them, are you going to wait until they grow up to marry them? I really enjoy when the readings from the Book of Ruth come, because there are so few stories in the Bible, really, that concentrate solely around women.
That's right. Yeah.
And we really get a chance to really kind of see how these very resourceful women, in a time when women were property almost, are able to go forward and kind of turn their lives around and be able to survive.
Sure. And another piece to this story, too, that's very important, is that these are Israelite women. I mean, Naomi is an Israelite, and they're living in Moab. Her husband is Moab, and her sons go to Moab. Moab is a little country on the east of the Dead Sea, in the Jordan River, that space over there. And there have been times when the two countries have been at war with each other, but apparently there's famine in the land too. I mean, the author doesn't say that directly, except later on, when Naomi has to decide what she's going to do. It turns out that conditions are a little bit better in Israel, so she decides to go back to her native country, But it also puts into perspective the fact that her two daughters-in-law, which are Oprah and Ruth, are Moabites, and they have to decide what they're going to do. Are they going to stay in their own country with their own people, or are they going to go with Naomi back to Israel?
Yeah, they would have been, in fact, there's Old Testament law that, basically said that you should not marry, that the Israelites should not marry these foreign people.
That's right,
so,
that's right.
It brings me back to the 60s, and the 50s, where African Americans wasn't seen as the thing to do for the biracial and mixed race, marriages. We can think of it as basically very similar in nature. And she was going back, Naomi was going back, and she was bringing these foreigners these foreigners were choosing to go back.
Choosing to go back, that's right.
And, you have to wonder if Naomi really didn't want them, or didn't want to subject herself to the fact that she was bringing these foreigners back to the land of Israel. Yeah. I mean, it says at the very end of this, and when she saw that they had made up their mind, they said no more to her, or Naomi said no more to them. And it was like, okay, is she mad? I mean, is she upset that Ruth wants to go with her, or is she happy?
Or she is so impressed that these two, these are daughters-in-law. So you got the whole mother-in-law, daughter-in-law stuff going on, right?
Right.
Which sometimes works, but not necessarily, because sometimes there's jealousy, and in this case, the two daughters-in-law say, the most important thing in my life is you. And so I'm going to share whatever happens to you, and we're going to see if we can make something out of this.
In fact, in one other translation that I have here in front of me, that line which you read that said, when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, referring to Ruth, she said no more to her. The New International Version reads, when Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her.
Oh.
Which has a little bit of a different kind of ring to it.
So it's like she respected her.
So we kind of don't really know. I mean, I think as we read the rest of this story, next week and some of it, and we hear a little bit more about what happens to these two women, Naomi and Ruth. We'll get an idea, really, of what that was and what Naomi may have been feeling at that point. But right now, it's a little bit up in the air as far as how that goes and how she's really feeling.
No, another interesting thing about this story is that God isn't mentioned really. And,
no, not at all.
And so this is a story about two women that are trying to work things out. I mean, I think there's some mention that God has some interest in this, and she. And Naomi will talk about how God has dealt with her bitterly, and she can't understand why this is happening to her. But still, it isn't clear in these first 18 verses how the Spirit of God is working in the relationship between these three women and what happens to them.
Yes, I mean, it is. It's very unclear. I mean, here's what's going on. Naomi says that she's bitter. And
That's
it's
right.
almost, she's also saying it's been a little worse on me than it has on you, talking
right.
to, her sisters-in-law. I would assume it's because she was older.
Yeah.
But that may be.
But maybe she'd been a very devout woman, and she trusted God in all the decisions, and now something had gone wrong, and she couldn't understand why this was happening to her, which is a natural response as well.
Because the theology of the time was that if you obeyed God and were righteous and obeyed the rules, that good things would happen to you, and if something bad happened to you, it was because you had done something wrong.
That's right.
That was the basic theology of the day.
And in this case, you're a woman too. So
and you're a woman too, so you've got a strike against you to begin with.
Two strikes against you. Patriarchal society, and even God is against you.
And it's and there's a definite, Ruth clung to her. I mean, this was seemed to be more than a daughter-in-law, mother-in-law kind of relationship going there. There certainly was a real bond between these two women. And these two women have names. Even when we do see stories about women, it's oftentimes somebody's wife and somebody's husband, somebody's wife, somebody's daughter. We don't even have a name, but these are names, and not only are they named, but the book is named after them.
Another thing that we haven't mentioned yet is the importance of the family unit in Israelite society. I mean, that's why property stuck with the male, if you will, and it was intended to remain with the male no matter what happened to the marriage, and how individuals were expected to. I hope I'm right in saying this. Individuals were expected to subsume their needs to the needs of the family.
I would say that was a fair.
That's right, and that's what Ruth does.
That's what Ruth
She
what
says,
Ruth.
I'm part of your family now, and I'm going to put my destiny really in your hands.
I also wondered when I heard this, and they said that Naomi told him to go back to your mother's house. In such a patriarchal society, I always wondered why they didn't say go back to your father's house and not your mother's house. It's just something that kind of popped into my head, and I'm not exactly sure I know the answer.
No, I don't either.
But it is something that I wonder about.
Maybe she was widowed too.
Maybe she was widowed as well.
Yeah,
that's always a possibility. But it is. I think you're right in the fact that when you said one of the strong things that I don't think we've mentioned a lot is this fact that these were two different people of different spiritual backgrounds and different, and they were not, the Israelites in general with the Moab people were not real friendly.
Yep.
I mean, they really were bitter enemies, fought, and they did not think well of each other at all. So for Ruth to say, I'm going back to Israel, to Bethlehem with you and to the land of the Israelites was really a big, big thing.
That's right.
And that Ruth accepted her, that Ruth even, and
so that there was mutual respect.
There had to be mutual respect for these two women.
Okay, let's move on to the passage from Mark, which you're going to read, and we'll work on that a little bit. And then if we've got a few minutes left over, we'll try to put it all together.
Well, as you probably remember, or maybe not, Mark is one of the first Gospels, or is considered to be the first Gospel, the earliest Gospel written. This particular passage, chapter 12 of Mark, takes place after Jesus has come into Palm Sunday. It's just kind of ended. He's in Jerusalem. And as we know, the Sadducees and the Pharisees are not particularly happy to see this man around, and they're trying to bait him to kind of say something that they can arrest him upon. And they're asking all kinds of questions, hoping to kind of get him to admit to something that they might be able to arrest him on.
Although in this case, it looks like we have a friendly scribe.
We do have a friendly scribe.
Okay.
Yes, we certainly do. The passage reads, "One of the scribes came near and heard them disputing one another, and seeing that he answered them well, he asked him," the scribe asked Jesus, "which commandment is the first of all?" Jesus answered, "The first is, 'Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength. The second is this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these." Then the scribe said to Jesus, "You are right, teacher. You have truly said that he is one, and beside him there is no others. And to love him with all the heart, and with all the understanding, and with all the strength, and to love one's neighbor as oneself. This is much more important than all the burnt offerings and sacrifices." When Jesus saw that the scribe had answered wisely, Jesus said to him, "You are not far from the kingdom of God." After that, no one dared to ask Jesus any questions.
So
we have a friendly person
friendly,
asking the question.
And also another little note to this passage is that it appears that this takes place in a temple. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would. This is definitely in the temple.
Yeah. And another couple of other notes in the in interpretation, perhaps, is that these two the commandments, things are called the Great Commandments, of course. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and mind and strength, and you shall love your neighbor yourself. One of those is from Deuteronomy,
right, and
the other is from Leviticus. Yeah, and so Jesus is consciously quoting parts of the Jewish law in answer to the question
that would have been known to the people that were listening.
Right,
they would have been aware that he was. Most of them probably would have been aware.
Why do you think he was doing that? Was he? We're in the days of good politicians now that try to say things that are going to get themselves in good with people who are listening. Do you suppose Jesus was being the politician here, or was he saying something else?
I think that Jesus was being the teacher, and he was trying to summarize all the laws in very short and very succinct type of way. Mm-hmm. That he was taking, we usually think of the 10 Commandments, but as You know, John, there's 513 commandments in that book that we don't, normally we look at the first 10. But if you look at those 10, all of them will fit into one of these two categories. That your God is one, that you remember the Sabbath to keep it holy, that you and that you love your neighbor, that you don't steal from them, you don't lie to them, you don't. But it also opens it all up to a whole variety of other things as well. And Jesus said, I came not to abolish the law, but
to fulfill it.
But to fulfill the law. And I think this is the old less is more way back in Jesus' time, where he's making this general statement, which in some ways makes it harder for us. Because what does it really mean to love our neighbor? It's easier when they say, well, that means don't steal, don't lie, don't do this, don't do that, don't do the other thing. But I think Jesus is saying there's a lot more than that here.
Yeah, one of the things that comes to me from reading this again is that these two commandments are kind of a combination of nouns and verbs.
Right.
You love the Lord your God. I mean, that's maybe an act almost of the will, but you love your neighbor as yourself is a verb. You show your love for God by the way you love your neighbor. Right?
That's right. Yeah. And I think the brilliant people who put together these lectionary readings put this reading from Ruth and this reading from Mark together for a reason. I think they go together. Love your neighbor. Your neighbor may be the person that you don't know very well, the neighbor that lives in Moab instead of in the land of Israel.
So Ruth was loving Naomi, and Naomi was loving Ruth by their commitment to go with each other into Israel.
Yeah, and to be kind to one another, whether or not they're your friend or your enemy in the total scheme of things. So I think that there was a reason why these two passages were put together. That what does it mean to love our neighbor, and what does it mean to love God? Yeah, I think it's in Luke when Luke says this same thing. He doesn't say them as two commandments separately. He says, and the second is like the first. The first one being love your God, and the second one is like the first, love your neighbor as yourself. So Luke seems to be saying that they're the same thing. That that's what it means to love your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind. But that's what it means, is to love your neighbor.
So saying you can't really separate
You can't separate the two. Now, we don't get as clear of that, in the Gospel of Mark. But they ask Jesus for the first commandment, and he gives two. Maybe he's giving just one. We don't know.
Yeah, you don't. Well, let's, a couple thoughts that I've had as I've read both of these is reflecting on the times that we live in now, which in some ways are very similar. I mean, our task is still to love God and love our neighbor. But we live in this, and I'm going to use this word awful, and I don't mean that in a way, but we live in this awful world where interreligious strife is enormous, and the distrust and the hatred between Muslims and Christians, for instance, is one of the problems of our time. Just listening to the radio as I drove up today, that I read about awful things happening in Syria and also in Afghanistan, where people are killing each other because of their different perspectives. And this is a God of the Moabites and the Israelites. Two Moabite young women and one Israelite older woman. And he is saying, it seems to me, that God, that's applying that to today, the God we worship is a God of Muslims as well as a God of Christians. And we better remember that, because there's nothing to be gained by thinking that we have a hold or a possession on truth.
Absolutely, and this election that's coming up, I'm a big social media person, and I'm on Facebook a lot. And there's a picture going around that, as much as this country seems to be divided between the two candidates, there's a great picture going around of Romney and Obama, and they're kind of pointing their fingers at each other, and there's little bubbles over their head that says, you are a child of God, both saying that to each other.
To each other, yeah.
To each other.
That's
and
neat.
as much as we may agree or disagree with one or the other, they are both children of God.
That's right.
And we need to remember that, whether we're talking Muslim and Christian or intra-Christianity.
Mm-hmm. And another fact that's interesting to me is looking ahead, what the text is going to be in a week from now. You will find the end of the story, and in the end of the story, what happens is that Naomi and Ruth go to Israel, and Ruth manages to meet Boaz, who is also a relative of her former husband Elimelech, and so Boaz has a kind of a claim on his inheritance, and he recognizes his responsibility to Ruth, and they marry, and then they marry, and then they have children, and they have children, and they have children. So I think the great grandchildren of Ruth and Boaz is Jesse, who is the father of David. Right. Who, of course, is in the line of inheritance for Jesus of Nazareth.
Right.
It's a neat little story, and it's a way of showing how God was working in that relationship in ways that weren't so noticeable as we were reading the story. So, anything else you want to say by summary?
Just that, as you said, Ruth is one of the few women in the genealogy in the New Testament that is mentioned in the genealogy of Jesus of Nazareth.
That's right. That's right.
One of the few. One of two, I think.
That's right. So I, on behalf of WSBS and the Southern Berkshire Clergy Fellowship, we want to thank you for joining us this morning on Religious Roundtable. I want to thank Kay Loudon, who's the pastor of the First Congregational Church in Housatonic, in particular, for being with us today. We hope that this has been interesting and valuable to you, and we encourage you to tune in every Sunday at 8:30 on WSBS and come back with us again. Thank you.
Thank you.
Religious Roundtable is pre-recorded in the